Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay. I'm a historian, specifically a naval historian, and you have found this on week 4 of a 9-part series I am doing, in which I am reading out my master's thesis that I completed 5 years ago, and also giving an update of where my research is. The master's thesis is titled "The Submarine and Maritime Strategy." An examination of the role in which the submarine filled in early 20th century maritime strategy. And today we're going to go through Chapter 3, entitled The Royal Navy. Quote, "It's astonishing to me, perfectly astonishing, how the very best amongst us absolutely fail to recognize the vast impending revolution in naval warfare and naval strategy that the submarine will accomplish." End quote. Admiral Sir John A. Fisher, Records. The Royal Navy made the decision to invest in submarines early in their development, which resulted in 5 submarines in service by 1902, with an additional 4 on order. Archibald Hurd noted that while British naval establishment generally ridiculed and looked down on French maritime developments, however, when it came to the submarine, the Admiralty noticed their cross-channel rivals' enthusiasm for this vessel and took note of the American efforts to fix the issues. Rear Admiral Lord Charles Beresford wrote to Fisher in 1900, noting that, quote, "When a common-sense, level-headed nation like that of the United States has tried and adopted submarine boats, it will appear probable that such craft must have some value in warlike operations." End quote. By the end of 1901, the potential of the submarine to inflict damage on the merchant fleet was recognized by senior officers of the Royal Navy. In a message to Lord Selborne, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, Parliamentary Secretary H. Oakley Arnold Foster noted, quote, "that by far the best protection for our mercantile shipping, and indeed our men of war, against submarines, is to keep them as possible out of the effective range of action of these vessels." End quote. Yet despite this early recognition of the potential threat that the submarine presented to merchant shipping, the Royal Navy, like most of its counterparts in the rest of the world, chose to use these vessels as defensive weapons. Flotilla defense. Central to the Royal Navy's investments into submarines at this early stage was the strategy of flotilla defense, which Fisher sought to employ to defend the British Isles from an invasion. What this strategy entailed was the use of submarines and destroyers to serve as the first line of defense against an invading navy. These vessels would be deployed far from the British shore and had orders to attack the transports and capital ships of any invasion force that appeared. The ability of the submarine and the destroyer to inflict massive damage on an enemy invasion force with their torpedoes, and the near impossibility of being able to detect these vessels with the technology available at the time, meant that a flotilla defense would serve as a deterrence. The principal method that Fisher chose to deter an enemy attack on the home islands was by deploying the Royal Navy in a manner that would cause mass casualties among the invading fleet. As Fisher noted in a letter to Lord Balfour, quote, "The destroyer by night and the submarine by day render it practically impossible for transports to remain in a locality long enough to discharge troops. As a check, therefore, to destructive raids on our territories where such aggression might be conceived, these boats should be a valuable adjunct." End quote. This threat of an enemy invasion was known to the British public, yet Hurd was optimistic about the submarine being able to deter an attack, noting, quote, "The more the powers of the latest British submarines are appreciated, the more conclusively it will be realized that in these craft, supported by destroyers and the main fleets, we have a powerful and complete defense against invasion." End quote. Earlier, Hurd commented that, quote, "It is probable that when the next war occurs, we shall find the Channel and some portions of the Mediterranean infested with these craft," end quote. Further aiding the submarine as a useful tool for the Royal Navy was that when submerged, it was undetectable until it was too late. In a 1908 memorandum, Fisher recognized that recent developments and maneuvers showed that, quote, "No practical means at present exist either to be feasible for effecting the destruction of the latest type of submarine or of being even warned of her approach," end quote. This lack of an effective countermeasure, along with increasing power and range of torpedoes and the ability to attack both at night and in broad daylight, meant that the submarine was a perfect ambush vessel. During the fleet maneuvers in March of 1904, the few early submarines made an impression on the umpires managing that exercise. The battleships and cruisers were struck by numerous practice torpedoes, which resulted in two of the ships being ruled as sunk, which did not please the surface fleet commander. The umpire's report came to the conclusion that, quote, "We consider that the submarine, used as either an offensive or defensive weapon, has achieved a state of completion and perfection which must render it in naval warfare a continual danger and menace to an enemy in close waters or in any position within its radius of action. Its capabilities in the hands of a well-trained and experienced officers are very great, and fear of what it can do renders its strength still greater. Every vessel within its radius at sea or in harbor is open to its attack," end quote. On the eve of the First World War, the Royal Navy had flotillas of submarines stationed at each of the major ports along the English Channel. Along with squadrons of destroyers and connected by wireless telegraph, the British had established the flotilla defense scheme, paired with a distance blockade as the first line of protection from a foreign invasion. In the case for submarines, despite the apparent advantages that the submarine presented to the Royal Navy, the construction of dreadnoughts continued. It has been made clear that Fisher preferred to use smaller vessels to defend the home islands and was attempting to phase out the battleship in favor of the faster, lighter, but still all large gun battlecruiser. In his compilation records, Fisher made his preference clear. Quote, "The submarine is the coming type of war vessel for sea fighting. And what is it that the coming of the submarine really means? It means that the whole foundation of our traditional strategy, which served us so well in the past, has been broken down. The foundation of that strategy was blockade. The fleet did not exist merely to win battles. That was the means, not the end. The ultimate purpose of the fleet was to make blockade possible for us and impossible for our enemy. Where that situation was set up, we could do what we liked with him on the sea, and despite a state of war, England grew steadily richer. But with the advent of the long-range ocean-going submarine, that has all gone. Surface ships can no longer either maintain or prevent blockade, and with this conception of blockade are broken up all the consequences, direct and indirect, that used to flow from it. All our old ideas of strategy are simmering in the melting pot," end quote. However, dreadnoughts continue to be launched down the slipways of Great Britain's shipyards. The question is, why did the construction of battleships continue, especially when it would have been just as effective and more cost-efficient to pursue the flotilla defense concept exclusively? The principal reason for the continued construction of battleships was in response to Tirpitz's efforts to increase the size of the German battle fleet. By 1904, the two-power standard had been in place for 15 years. This standard required that the Admiralty to maintain naval construction of capital ships at a pace that assured the Royal Navy had more battleships than the next two largest navies combined. Yet this also resulted in the Admiralty's budget trebling during that period of time. Fisher was elevated to the position of First Sea Lord because he was the most senior officer who could trim the fat of the Admiralty in order to bring the cost of maintaining a large navy down. An advantage that the submarine presented to Fisher was that it was an affordable weapons platform, especially in comparison to the dreadnoughts. In 1913, the cost to build and equip a single Queen Elizabeth-class dreadnought was £2,685,799. By comparison, an E-type submarine was merely £105,560. In other words, on the eve of war, the Royal Navy could have acquired 25 submarines for the price of one dreadnought. In actuality, Admiralty financial records show that only 7 submarines were purchased in 1913. It should be noted that the battle cruisers that Fisher was also champion were just as expensive as the dreadnoughts, with a Tiger-class ship costing £2,593,100 in 1912. For someone who's chosen to lead the Royal Navy because of his ability to run a fleet in a cost-effective manner, it is apparent that the submarine was a low-cost, high-reward investment which attracted Fisher to them. Relating to his cost-cutting measures was that one of Fisher's first actions was to decommission and scrap a large number of obsolete ships of all classes. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Royal Navy had a massive fleet of vessels deployed around the world, with the most advanced ships located closer to the British Isles, and the older ones kept in commission at overseas stations to show the flag in foreign ports. While these older vessels being sent to the shipbreakers, it was also necessary to build enough battleships to offset the ones that were commissioned before 1888. This also had the benefit of cutting the expense of maintaining these obsolete ships from the naval budget, resulting in immediate savings of £845,000 just in 1905. Submarines required smaller crews to man them, especially in comparison to the dreadnoughts. Most battleships of the days of the early 20th century were manned by 800 to 1,200 officers and sailors, whereas the typical submarine at the time had a small crew of approximately 30. Manpower for the ever-expanding Royal Navy had been a issue since the passage of the Naval Defense Act of 1889 and became one of the first problems that Fisher sought to resolve when he became First Sea Lord. Fisher's policy to provide nucleus crews to all ships held in reserves at 2/5 of their rated complement rather than fully manned allowed for these warships to be maintained while freeing up sailors for the active fleet. By attempting to deploy a large number of submarines in place of the large dreadnoughts, fewer sailors would be needed to be recruited to fulfill the Navy's manpower requirements. Additionally, as the First World War would show, able men that are qualified to serve in the military are a finite resource. Therefore, the more men that could have been freed up for the war of attrition on the Western Front, the more it would have aided the Allies' efforts to end the stalemate. Finally, submarines could be built to replace the older vessels that were scrapped as they had became obsolete. Fisher's scrapping policy in 1904 to 1905 resulted in 154 older warships being taken out of service. Initially, this policy was able to free up numerous sailors for reassignment to newer ships and reduce the Royal Navy's annual maintenance budget. As the submarine underwent further development and Fisher's flotilla defense tactic began to take hold in the Admiralty, this vessel became the preferred choice of naval planners to construct. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, came to view the submarine as a cost-effective ship that could defend the British Isles while allowing the capital ships to concentrate their efforts against the enemy fleet. The state of anti-submarine warfare. The Royal Navy recognized the need to develop effective countermeasures to protect the fleet from a submarine attack as early as their initial investment in these vessels. Fisher, serving as commander of the Mediterranean fleet at the turn of the century, kept himself apprised of the French efforts to develop their submarines. He suggested to the Admiralty that the Royal Navy forego their ban on contact mines and use that weapon to defend naval stations from a subsurface attack. After some initial reluctance, the Admiralty lifted their self-imposed ban and allowed for Fisher to deploy contact mines to defend his fleet while in port. Another reason for justifying the initial purchase of submarines by the Royal Navy was that they could be used to develop anti-submarine tactics. Being a new weapon on the high seas, and with the French acquiring more submarines, the need for developing countermeasures made the cost of the initial Holland boats necessary. As Mardar noted, the submarine threat had changed the battle fleet's tactics by 1914. Part of this was an increase in the range and accuracy of naval guns, and additionally, there was the maturation of the destroyer from an offensive torpedo launching platform into the multi-purpose escort it would become known for. By 1914, the Royal Navy's destroyers were fitted out with more guns than torpedoes and tasked with screening the battle fleet and protecting the battleships from enemy torpedo boats. It was also during this era that the seeds of the development of sonar were sown. Fisher's successor as First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Arthur Wilson, despite his skepticism of the submarine's potential, expanded his secret committee that was developing countermeasures. Wilson allowed the anti-submarine committee's budget to be increased, reassigned obsolete submarines for use as test vessels, and placed a couple of flag officers at its head. One of the ideas that came from this committee was the idea that sound waves could be used to detect objects underwater. Eyewitness accounts indicate that this ideal came under consideration at the time of the sinking of Titanic. However, the early records from the secret anti-submarine committee have disappeared. Anglo-German naval tensions. Any history of the Royal Navy during the early years of the 20th century would be incomplete without a discussion of the Anglo-German naval arms race. Many scholars would agree that the launching of the HMS Dreadnought was the latest possible start of these tensions, although Ronald B. St. John argues that the Naval Defense Act of 1889 should be viewed as the start of the naval arms race between Germany and Great Britain. What St. John failed to realize in his assessment was that the embarrassing defeat of the Russian Baltic Fleet by the Imperial Japanese Navy at Tsushima in 1905, Germany was not viewed as a major threat to the Royal Navy. When Fisher was named First Sea Lord in 1904, he was more concerned by the threat of Russian and French cruisers, not the expanding German Navy. What is certain that the Dreadnought was introduced to the world when the rapidly growing Imperial German Navy and the U.S. Navy had become the next largest navies after the Royal Navy. Fortunately for Great Britain, the United States was a friendly nation and viewed as a logical ally of the Crown. Germany, under Tirpitz' guidance, posed a legitimate threat to the security of the British Isles, if not to the Royal Navy's maritime supremacy. From 1906 onward, the Admiralty would make their war plans and perform their maneuvers with the German Navy as the projected enemy. The Admiralty continued to respond to the expanding German threat by increasing the number of hulls that they were launching. This would cause more strain on the parliamentary budget and resulted in Churchill being appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, as H.H. Asquith's Liberal government believed that he could keep the Royal Navy's expenses in check. In addition to mitigating the fiscal costs of maintaining the two-power standard, Churchill made gestures to reduce the tensions between Great Britain and Germany. Including in those overtures to Germany was a recommendation that both nations observe a construction holiday for a year, and proposing that the Royal Navy would substitute battleships and battlecruisers for smaller vessels such as destroyers and submarines. These gestures were presented to Germany intent on continuing their naval program in spite of rising costs and international tensions and intrigue. Much has been written about Fisher's influence on the naval affairs of the 20th century, particularly in regards to the dreadnoughts and battlecruisers that the Royal Navy pioneered. What tends to be lost in the historical discussion was that Fisher's influence had spread to many officers who would be key members of the Royal Navy after his tenure as First Sea Lord. The Fish Pond, as they were known, included Sir John Jellicoe, Sir George Callahan, Sir Percy Scott, and eventually Churchill. Lambert argues that after Fisher's retirement in 1910, several members of Fish Pond, especially Callahan, challenged Wilson's more traditional maritime policies. The focus of Callahan's disagreements was that Wilson's war plans called for a close blockade of an enemy rather than a distance blockade or flotilla defense. While not the flotilla defense that Fisher had advocated for, a distance blockade was designed to prevent an enemy navy, such as the High Seas Fleet, from sorting out of their home port. If the enemy did leave, the Royal Navy's battle fleet would be able to respond quickly to intercept the challenger in the North Sea or the English Channel. Submarines would be deployed as scouts, searching for signs of the enemy fleet leaving port, and when possible, attempt to attack the battleships. The downside to a distance blockade was that the gaps in coverage would exist, allowing for enemy warships to slip through. Yet it was Fisher's influence on Churchill that has gone under the radar until recent years. Mardar did discuss the role that Fisher played as an unofficial advisor to Churchill beginning in 1911. Lambert, in Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution and British Naval Policy 1913 and 1914, argues that Churchill was named to the Admiralty with the task of bringing costs back in line after Wilson's spending on new battleships added more burden to the national budget. Churchill was intrigued by Fisher's ideals, which resulted that the First Lord was advocating for a substitution policy in the 1914 estimates. This policy would substitute a battleship for either destroyers or submarines, which Churchill advocated for on fiscal grounds. Jellicoe, Prince Louis of Battenberg, and Scott were in favor of this substitution policy. By 1914, the Sea Lords of the Royal Navy were in agreement that the submarine was rendering the battleship obsolete. They only disagreed on the timing. As a final note on Churchill's tenure at Whitehall during the pre-war years, previous scholars have oversold his influence over naval policies. As Lambert and Goff both observed, Fisher's influence continued to dominate the thinking of the senior Sea Lords. Churchill came to the Admiralty understanding this, and one of his first actions was to reach out to Fisher and seek his counsel as noted above. Finally, it should be noted that today's navies are closer in their composition to what Fisher had advocated for in his flotilla defense strategy. The last battleships were decommissioned during the early 1990s, with destroyers and submarines forming the core of most navies today. It is clear to any observer that is familiar with Fisher's reforms that these are fleets that he would have recognized as ones as having similarities to what he was attempting to shift the Royal Navy towards. However, the continued construction of the German battle fleet and demands by Parliament to maintain naval supremacy delayed this transition by several decades. And that is the end of the third chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and share to anyone who you think would be interested. If you do leave a comment, please be kind to each other. And I will see you next week for chapter 4, in which we go over the Imperial German Navy. Bye.